What's it really like to work for a startup? Is it all chaos? Is it inherently more risky than working for a large established corporate? What are the benefits and what are the downsides? That's what we're going to be talking about in this week's episode. I'm Jeremy Klein, and this is Change Work Life. Hello and welcome to Change Work Life, the show that's all about beating the Sunday evening blues and enjoying Mondays again. If you want to know how you can enjoy a more satisfying and fulfilling working life, you're in the right place. When you think about startups, what images come to mind? Is it a quirky, brightly coloured, open-plan office in a hipster part of town with beers in the fridge and a slightly chaotic atmosphere? What's it really like to work in a startup, and how do you know if it's right for you? My guest this week is Steve Grace, who's the founder and CEO of the Nudge Group, which specialises in connecting startups and scale-ups with world-class talent. Steve, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. I've been looking forward to this.
So Steve, why are we talking to you? What's your background? What makes you the expert on startups and scale-ups?
I'm sitting here embedded, actually not tonight because they've all gone home, but I'm embedded in the startup ecosystem of Australia, I guess. I think there's a couple of things that would probably be relevant. One, I've got 4 or 5 companies I've started now. So I've got 5 of my own startups, although I've only got 4 that are running now, and I've sold the others. But my latest sort of, I guess, venture, Nudge, is totally immersed in startups, not just here in Australia, but also globally. So we help them with all kinds of things. And we've worked now in the last 5 years with over 400 startups, which is nuts, right? And they vary in sort of where they are in the life cycle. Some are pre-seed, some are seed. When we can talk about these terms later, some are series A, B, C, D, some are growing beyond that. Some are even in inception and in people's minds. And, you know, we work with incubators and we work with co-working spaces and we work with VC funds and private equity. So I think I've just, over that period of time, particularly the last 5 years, having worked quite closely with over 400, experienced just about every kind of different startup there is. Because much like any industry, you know, you could say, what's it like to work in a recruitment company? Depends on the recruitment company. What's it like to work in a startup? It depends very much on the startup and where they are. So hopefully, with all that experience, I've got some knowledge in there.
Yeah, I think you've just about established your credentials. All right, so we'll come to talk about some of those terms that you've just mentioned in a minute. But what is it that makes a startup versus something that isn't a startup? You know, I'm kind of thinking that there are lots of small companies out there which may have been running for 20 years. What is it that makes a startup a startup?
It's a really good question. Been asked that a couple of times, actually. I think a small business that is established, that is most likely profitable and sustaining on itself, that has no desire to be any bigger, is a small business. A startup is essentially an idea. And in my definition, a startup is something that wants to become a lot bigger. There is a desire there to grow. There's a desire there to dominate a market in a region such as Australia. There's a desire there to be a global business. There's a desire there to be the first to do something, you know. Whereas a small business is usually a business that already exists in numbers of other forms, and someone's grown a business to the size that they're comfortable with and is more so a lifestyle business than it is growing into something bigger, I guess. That's how I would define the difference. And then obviously a scale-up's a different thing as well. That's an even more difficult question.
Okay, so there's a desire on whoever's founding the startup to create this big thing. They've got their eye on some kind of domination, whether it's world domination or sector domination or something along those lines.
Yeah, I think so. And I think if you look at the popular view of a startup, it's usually something that is backed by a venture fund. So it's a non-profitable business that requires people to invest in it to get it to a point where, one, it's either sellable, so it can become part of a larger entity where doesn't matter whether it's profitable because it's adding value, or 2, it becomes profitable, gets listed on the stock exchange or something like that. And that journey can be quite long.
Is the motivation for founding a startup always some kind of an exit?
Definitely not. I think if you listen to any podcast on startups and you listen to any successful founder advising potential founders, they'll always tell you that it has to be about solving a problem. It's not about money. It's not about an exit. It's not about lifestyle. If you want to succeed, and obviously we know that there's a very high failure rate in startups, although that is inflated, but you have to want to solve a problem. And most of the really, really successful ones are something that someone has experienced personally, upset them or offended them to such a state that they went out there and decided that's not acceptable. I'm going to go and change that. That's why the sort of advice is always don't focus on the exit, don't focus on the money. But then on the other side of the coin, you'll also hear just as many founders say, you have to think about your exit and you have to think about your plan, because otherwise how can you aim towards it? So it's kind of contradictory, but I think it's, in my view, it's probably in reality 50-50. I reckon 50% of people start startups because there's a problem they want to solve. The other 50 do it because they want to make some money and retire or be the glamorous founder in the news or whatever it might be. Potentially what you could say the wrong reasons.
Some of the terms that you mentioned earlier around funding stage, pre-seed, seed, series A, B, C, D, but what does all that mean?
The interesting thing about the startup ecosystem is it has its own language. And I, many years ago, used to run a course to teach people how to make the move from corporate into startup. And the first thing you've actually got to do is learn the language. And the language goes, gosh, there's so much of it. But I think if you're talking about stages, there's a number of keywords. The first one I use is not a funding stage. It's called bootstrapped. And I'm sure people have heard that term, don't necessarily always know what it means. A bootstrap business is a business that hasn't taken any funding. So essentially, the founder has either funded the business themselves or the business funds itself with its own revenue. That is what a bootstrap business is called. And they typically take a lot longer to grow because they don't have the capital for rapid growth. Services companies can often be bootstrapped because they don't require massive capital investment. But most startups, particularly technology startups, which is, I guess, what most people think about, require enormous investment to build the technology to a point where they can actually just start to sell it. And then even more so to build it out and build features and products and make it better and better before it can turn a profit. And that requires funding that comes in the forms of maybe only a few things. Usually, friends and family is obviously always one. There's angel investors, which are individuals who have spare money that they want to invest in businesses, and they usually come in at a relatively early stage. And then you sort of hit the venture capital market, which are companies that invest in businesses purely to help them grow. There's a few other forms of sort of funding we can talk about later if you wish, but venture capital is where all the terms come. And the terms typically go pre-seed, seed, Series A, Series B, D, E, on. And I think I've never seen anyone get past Series F, actually, or maybe H. But they refer to the stage that the company is at, right? So a pre-seed company is a small amount of money, and it's usually when someone has formulated an idea. They don't know if the customers want it. They don't know if they can make it work. They haven't really built anything. It's really just an idea. Once they've sort of got to a stage where that idea looks like it's going to work, they go into what is a seed phase. And the seed phase is where they find what they call product market fit, which is where they prove that someone out there is willing to pay for their product. And these stages, will increase in terms of the amounts of money people will invest. So they tend to start small, and then the larger ones are obviously bigger. Series A, B, C, D, E, F, they are just phases of growth. And what will typically happen is, if you raise money at Series A, and a Series A business is something that's a real business, they've got customers, it's proven, it's now, okay, we need to scale it, we need to hire lots of people, we need to hire marketing, we need to hire sales, all that kind of stuff. So they'll raise money to do that. And the Series B will be a continuation of that. And to get those fundings, what these venture capital funds will do is they'll set targets for them, very much like a salesperson or even schoolwork or something like that. And they'll say, right, here's X amount of money for your Series A. Now, prove to us you can make this work. Prove to us you're a good business person. Grow it by this amount. Get this amount of subscribers. Release these products, whatever it is those targets are, within this time frame. And then we'll give you some more money to continue going. So I liken it to, and I don't know how popular this view is, I liken it to a parent giving a child money. If you can do this, I'll give you this. If you wash these 3 cups, I'll give you. It's kind of like that. It's like, if you can behave like a bit of an adult and show me you can run a business, I'll give you some more money. That's kind of how it looks to me from the outside. I don't think any of the venture capital funds or founders would love that analogy, but that's kind of the way I see it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and so when it comes to employing staff, so not bringing in, co-founders or whatever, but, employing someone, paying them a salary. Is that something that can happen even at the pre-seed stage, or do they tend to be a little bit bigger before they start to take on a workforce?
It varies. Like, I think what you'll get in startups in that very, very early stage is you will get salaries that are significantly lower than what the market rate would pay. At this stage, you will often find that founders will give you equity. Now, equity is a share in the business. It's ownership in that business. They will get it at what is a very low valuation. As you can imagine, when a business is very young with an idea that's not proven, that equity is not worth an awful lot of money because it could easily just fizz out. So as a loyal employee coming in as an early stage, you might take 20, 30, 40, 50% cut on your wage, but get a percentage of equity on the promise that if you can make it work, that equity could be worth millions and millions of dollars later. And that's kind of how that works. But, some people still will feel that there are certain roles that are so pivotal and perhaps the founding team have really no idea about that they might pay market rate. And that's a conversation they will have to have if they're raising money with their venture fund as to why they should be doing that. So that doesn't happen often. You do find salaries in the early stages are significantly lower, but it's a little like, and I know you and I spoke about this months ago when we first met, it's a little like the fashion industry. The fashion industry, when I was growing up, was the most glamorous, as was photography and as was magazines, but they paid the worst. And they paid the worst because people wanted to work in those industries and they were seen as glamorous and fun. And I think startups have a little bit of that as well. Obviously, there's the economic side of it, but I also think there is some glamour in the startup industry, which is completely unfounded.
That leads nicely on to my next question, which is, what are the common misconceptions people have about working for startups? And I'd like you to think about both positive and negative in your answer.
Gosh, there's so many. I think it's not so much misconceptions. I mean, there are some misconceptions. Like, obviously, there are the glamorized versions that you see on television. There's the WeWork stories. There's the Uber stories that we've all seen on streaming platforms. It's not beanbags. It's not table tennis. Although there are beanbags and there are table tennis, there's actually very little of that these days. It's not all fun. It's not drinking. It's not running around, in crazy outfits. It's not all fun. It's actually pretty much the opposite. And the earlier the phase the company is in, the harder they're working. They're often working crazy, crazy hours. They're doing things that they don't know how to do. I think probably the biggest misconception of startups is that it's just like working in a corporate, but a bit more fun. Nothing like that at all. And I think there are very, very different environments that startups go through, and there are very, very different types of personalities that will fit into those startups. There are not many personalities that will fit into a startup at a pre-seed and seed and still work well in a Series D and E. That whole journey that company goes on, the staff that are in it, it's unlikely many will see that whole journey through because they have to vary enormously. But it's a lot of work. I can sort of explain the differences, if you like, between the phases because it's not too complicated. Would you like me to do that?
Yeah, sure.
The biggest thing I see with people from corporates who want to move into startups is they want to go into an early stage, they want to get equity, they want to make millions and all that kind of stuff. The very early stages of a startup are utter chaos. There's very little resources. There's no money. There's certainly nobody to create a template for you or to show you where the form is or the intranet. Or there's nothing. There's literally nothing there. And whatever your job title is almost irrelevant. You tend to have small groups of people who love ambiguity. They hate structure. They love going from thing to thing to thing. They don't mind not finishing things. They don't mind starting thinking and changing their mind and doing something else. They even relish that. They tend to be quite scatterbrained kind of people that think very differently and have lots of energy and just want to get things done. They don't need things to be done perfectly. They just need them to work enough to get to the next phase. That's a very different personality to, say, a Series B, where you've got a company that's getting quite serious. And people like that in a company like that are a disaster because they cause mayhem. You've got many more staff. Everyone's got very specific roles. And it's very, very clear what everyone has to do. And there is structure and there are forms and there are HR and there are marketing. So you take an early stage person and you put them in a Series B, C, they cause absolute mayhem and often actually can be really damaging to the growth of the business. But then you take a Series B or D person or a corporate person and put them in this environment and they freak out because there's nothing, it's just not what they're used to. And they get frustrated because things keep changing and they don't know how to do that. So why are you asking me how to do that? That's not my job. So you kind of go from a chaos into order and there's all the phases in between. And I think the problem with people who haven't worked in the industry is they don't actually know where they fit. They think they do, but they don't. You can ask some questions and there are interviewing techniques that will tell you. And most people will begin to understand that. The hardest part, I think, for us when we've recruited, particularly people who want to go to an early stage but are clearly not going to survive in that, is telling them that they're not suited to that environment. It doesn't go down well, ever. I don't think I've ever had someone go, oh, yes, you're right, I'll go for a later stage. People get quite upset. They get quite defensive. They think that you're criticizing them. So it's very personality-driven and much less skills-driven at the beginning. And I think that's a big leap for someone that's come from a larger organization.
Isn't a lot of what you've just said also relevant for the founders themselves? I mean, doesn't that mean that founders potentially struggle as the business grows and becomes a more serious business?
Look, it does. Founders are another breed altogether. There needs to be an element of huge risk-taking to be a founder, like comfortable with that and not necessarily see it as risk-taking. Founders tend to have egos and need them fed. Now, at varying degrees, there are degrees that are healthy and there are degrees that are not. And founders do go through a journey. There's some really good stories about founders who haven't been able to let go at certain stages and cause problems, and some founders who have seen it all the way through. There are very few that see it all the way through, and I'm always blown away and impressed. Myself as a founder, I know where I tap out in terms of my skill sets. I'm much better in the early stage. And the reality is, if you can work out where that is and you can delegate those roles and move away and become ambassador, hire a CEO, COO, chief of staff, whatever it is, and begin to relinquish the things that you are bad at, you will be a better founder. But at the same time, a little like being a parent, founders don't like letting go of their essential child. So founder journeys are very well documented, some great books on stories on it. But I think there's a lot more education around it now. But founders are a totally different breed to everybody else as well. So, yeah, there's a lot of interesting personalities in this ecosystem, it has to be said.
You talked a little bit about some of the misconceptions, and I'm curious as to whether there are any deeply held negative misconceptions about working for startups which aren't really that true.
Yeah, there definitely are. I think a lot of people see it as very high risk and that there's a high chance they'll lose their job. This is just not true if you look at data, which is what everybody does these days. Interestingly enough, you're far more likely to be made redundant from a large organization than you are from a startup. I think, look, there's definitely a percentage of startups that will not make it and they will close down. There's no question about that. But if you actually really look at the figures, statistically, you're far more likely to lose your job in a larger organization over a cycle of maybe five to 10 years. So, at the end of the day, you don't have to make money as a startup. You just have to get funding and then you just have to hit the timelines, right? So if you've got the right team, there's no reason a startup should fail, and there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to get paid. So I think that's probably the biggest misconception. Now, you have to do your research. You have to look at who's funding them. You have to look at how crazy that founder is. And is that founder going to cause it all to collapse in a heap, or are they going to drive it through? And those are all difficult questions to ask. But they're no different than asking that question of a department within a new business. Let's say a big tech company decides to create a new department, launching into a new area. If the person launching that department doesn't make it work, that department will get closed down or offshored. So, look, I think that's probably the biggest misconception that I get. I think that you don't get paid anything. That's also not true. Once you do get past those very early stages, there's some very attractive wages out there. I think a lot of people think they're going to get massive chunks of equity. I don't think people realize the small percentages of equity they might get. They might get 0.05%, which could be worth millions, but could be worth nothing. So there's a lot of misconceptions around that. I think also there's a lot of people think that no one's taking it seriously, that they're going to have to, I guess, almost change their personality. There's a lot of very serious people in the startup sector trying to do a lot of very serious things. And I think there's a lot of people trying to solve problems that have real, genuine meaning. And this is one of the massive benefits of startups, is that often in a larger organization, regardless of what they may say in their policies about how they're trying to save the world, planet, charities, whatever it is, it's hard to connect in a large organization when you're in a startup and you're seeing what it's doing, you're seeing how it's solving a problem. And even if they do have a relationship with a charity. There's a very great fintech that has a really strong partnership with Parlay around plastic in the ocean, and they live by that. And you can really connect with some of those things because you're right in there and you're seeing it, and you can impact it. The things that you do in an organization of 20 people impact everybody in that organization. The things that you do in an organization of 200,000 people, yes, they do, but it's very, very difficult to really get any feeling about that. So it's a very different world, and it can be incredibly rewarding. And I do believe not just that the world has changed in terms of startups are much more prevalent now and a lot more people are trying to do them, but I think COVID made a lot of people want to do something of meaning. I think when suddenly they'd been in a job in a rut or a pattern or whatever you might call it, and they were going along quite happy and they were planning for their future, having that period at home gave a lot of time for people to reflect. And having the world potentially nearly end and everyone nearly die, which, was on the cards, right? Having that go through their minds has made a lot of people go, you know what, I really want to do something. And I think startups are the place to do that. And I think that's driven a lot of the culture that has grown. Australia has obviously exploded in startups compared to where it was. It was in a pretty poor place. So it was an easy rise. But I think all of this has sort of come together to create this perfect storm right now.
So let's build a little bit on some of what you said. So again, looking at both the positives and the negatives, what are some of the unique challenges and what are some of the unique benefits of working for a startup compared with working for a large corporate?
Unique challenges would be everything is changeable in the heartbeat. I think if you enjoy a constant stream of change and excitement and not knowing, uncertainty is something that human beings as a whole do not like. But at the same time, we also get bored if we don't have any, right? So you've got this weird this weird situation where humans hate uncertainty, was shown by COVID, but they also hate to know exactly what's happening that's boring to them. And in between, everyone has varying levels. So I think one of the unique challenges is startups offer a lot of uncertainty. That is very attractive to some people and not attractive to others. Most people have no idea if they haven't worked in one, whether it is or isn't. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges when they come in. I think one of the other biggest challenges when they come in is that really you kind of have to take responsibility for yourself and your career in that startup. No one's going to come along and have a one-on-one with you and give you your plan for your future and tell you how to excel in this business. If you want to excel in a startup, you have to be in some ways entrepreneurial. You don't have to be an entrepreneur per se, but you have to have an entrepreneurial spirit and go, you know what, I'm going to make this happen for me, which is a little bit counterintuitive for Australians. Very, very common in the US, not so common in the UK, and probably even less so here in terms of I'm taking responsibility for myself. People don't do that. They're getting better at it, and the younger generation are far better at it. But I think that's probably the biggest challenge I see for most people coming in is that suddenly nothing is looked after for them. It's like leaving home, I guess, from parents. There's a lot of children and parent analogies here. And I think they're very relevant in the startup world. You really have to grow up and go, if I want this to happen for me in this business, I'm going to have to do it myself. That's probably the greatest challenge. What were you saying, the other greatest benefit?
Yeah. What are the benefits?
Look, it has to be the camaraderie. The way people in this ecosystem, it shocked me when I really, I'd always gone around the fringes of it in all my career, but when I totally immersed in it, it really shocked me how the people in this ecosystem very much have the least amount of resources, the least amount of time, and they are the most generous with both of those outside of that. And the feeling of being part of a team, the feeling of doing something together, the feeling of having leadership that really bonds people on a common goal is just incredible. You don't get that as easily in a big corporation. And that's not the big corporation's fault. It's a different environment. It'd be incredibly hard to do that in a larger environment. Now, you get obviously departments and so forth in larger organizations, but it's just different. The energy and the positivity, because again, you need that. You can't be negative in this environment. No one will like that. It's an environment of uncertainty. You need that positivity. It really does, I think, catch a lot of people by surprise, and it's very, very addictive. And you find that it creeps into other areas of your life, which I think is a positive. So, I think that's the biggest benefit. Negativity, hours, Hours, the hours are long. They're going to be long. They're going to be up and down. We talk a lot about work-life balance. We talk a lot about hustle culture, getting sleep, all these kinds of things. And all these things are very important. And you should take notice of all these things. But if you're in a startup, there are going to be periods of time where those things have to go out the window because what needs to be done, and no one else is going to do it. And if you don't do it, the implications are highly serious. So you also have to be prepared to know that there will be times when you may be working late. You may not be able to do this. You may not be able to do that. And I think that's the biggest challenge for a lot of people who aren't necessarily used to that. And everybody just immerses themselves in that.
That's really interesting because there's been a lot said, certainly more recently and certainly post-pandemic, how Gen Z and millennials, that's not the lifestyle they want. They don't want to work all the long hours. They're happy to work hard, but they want work-life balance. They want life outside work. So are you seeing any kind of shift in the way startups are approaching it? Or is it just me? Does it just mean that there's kind of like a smaller pool of people who want to do that, who want the hustle culture, who want the long hours?
Look, I think there's a very generalization of this. I see just as many young people who are willing to work the hours. I think the difference is they want to work the hours on their terms. So there is a big, big difference between working in a startup and knowing that a project has to be done because you do know, the transparency in startups is far greater, of course, than it is in large organizations. So the willingness to do the work for that period of time is there. Whereas in a large organization, if someone expects you to stay, but there's no real reason and you can't see it, and you're just told you have to do it. It's the way it's approached. Also, it may interest you to know that most startup founders are not out of college and 20 years old. Most startup founders right now are sort of late 30s, early 40s. So it's an interesting fact in itself is that there's this huge shift of the age of founders has risen. And again, I put this down to COVID and people going, I need to do something. I want to do something. But I don't believe that the younger generation are lazy. I think there's lazy people. Of course there are. There's lazy older people. The difference is, I think that if you are mid-career and lazy, you can go and sit in Commonwealth Bank or NAB or ING or IBM or any one of these enormous organizations and quite easily hide. And it's almost impossible for them to know that you are lazy and not doing that. But if you are young, it's impossible to do that because everybody's watching you. So I think there's probably about the same percentage of lazy young people and lazy older people and middle-aged people and whatever's the appropriate thing to say. It's just not as visible. It's much easier for them to hide. Now, again, that's not a popular view, but I see, and I've had many people in that generation who I see who work far harder than a lot of people who probably are also writing those articles.
Yeah, I got to say the word lazy wasn't quite the one that I was kind of looking for because I don't think people are against working hard. I think it comes back to what you were saying about it being on their terms. So, my background is as a solicitor, and if I had plans for Valentine's Day and then, the partner that I'm sitting in with says, "Oh, I need this document for a meeting tomorrow. Can you help me search my office, which is an absolute pigsty to find it?" I'm feeling pretty hard done by in that kind of situation. Whereas if it's, I think it was purpose driven was the phrase you used. If people can kind of see why it's important, why they're doing this, then there's going to be much greater motivation rather than just, oh, well, this is what I have to do when I'm a junior in order to advance.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that there's a lot more self-control or self-discipline in startups. I think there's a lot more freedom. There's obviously a lot more working from home. There's a lot more trust. It's very much outcome driven rather than time driven. I think that's a big difference you'll see. You don't see startups clock watching. They are watching what the outcomes are. And I think if you are outcome driven, people will work whatever you need them to work to hit the outcomes because it's clear. Asking someone to search your office last minute, that's not outcome driven that you were aware of all week, right? Well, we've all been there. Let's not get into post-traumatic stress. I'm old enough to have lived through that well. So I think it's being treated more like a grown-up. So I think it's a world where there's probably a lot more trust. Now, look, that comes with its own challenges and people take advantage of that, but that happens in every environment. There's always going to be people that take advantage of that. I think in startup ecosystem, they tend to get found out a little sooner and a little quicker. They also don't tend to be gravitating towards that environment anyway.
You talked about the way that the company's evolved, and so the people evolve as startups go through their life cycle and move from pre-seed, seed, Series A, and so on. What are some of the ways that both the working culture and also the roles, the sorts of employees that they're going to have, how will those vary depending on what stage you're at?
So I think one of the hardest parts for any founder is when they move from a startup to a scale up. Now, I'll give you my definition of what that means. It's not defined anywhere accurately. It's just my version, just to be clear, before everyone jumps on and goes, he's wrong. To me, the view of a startup to scale up is when they do not have what I would call or what is called a runway. Now, a runway is a determining period of time before the money runs out. So you've been given $2 million. You know that it costs you X amount of money to run the business this month. You know how long that money is going to run until it runs out. That's called a runway. I think when a company hits where they've got their own revenue or they've got such a large amount of funding that the runway is not within the next 2-3 years, that's my view, they're becoming a scale up. They're no longer a startup. And that's when a lot of the roles will change. And that's when founders have to change a lot of their stuff. So founders believe, unfortunately, and you have to have a lot of romanticism, I think, to start a business, believe that the first 5 people that they start the business with will be there at the end. They'll all be millionaires on their boat and it'll be happy and everyone will be just so grateful to them for giving them an opportunity. That's not the reality. Very few of those early stage hires will make it past that sort of startup to scale up phase. And the reason being is that, like I mentioned earlier, in the early times, you need someone who's willing to do 4 different jobs, who can change and do something they've never done before, who can look things up, who can make things up, who get involved in everything, have their pies and everything. They know what's happening across the whole business. They love this ambiguity. They love the energy. They love the chaos. And that's great. But once you get to that point where you go into startup mode, then you need structure because you can't scale past a certain point without structure. So then suddenly you have roles that are very, very specific. You will have not someone who's doing product and marketing. You'll have maybe a whole team of marketing people who have specific roles and a whole team of people in product who have different roles. And if you've still got old little Johnny in the middle who used to do it all, guess what he does? He wants to get involved in all of it and he annoys the heck out of everybody. So he becomes an actual barrier in the growth and he becomes problematic. So we do a lot of coaching with founders on that they need to recognize this early. And there's a number of things you can do. You can either talk to your employees about it early on, so they know that it's coming where they're either going to have to find something else, which is okay. They can probably keep their equity and they can go off to another startup. That's quite common, more so overseas than it is here, but it's becoming more common here. Or there are other ways of doing that. And I think that probably the greatest version of this I saw was Fred from Finder. He had grown Finder to a certain point. He just felt completely lost, and there was a documentary about it. So what did he do? He went over to the States and launched Finder over there. He knew he was good at that beginning part. So what he did, he took himself out of the environment and put himself into a totally new one where it was all chaos again. And you can do that with employees. You can offer them, we're going to start a new product line. We're going to go into a new region. We're going to go off and do a little, there's opportunities, but more often than not, you have to let them go into a different business. You let them leave and then start to hire those people who love structure and love process, because that's the only way you're going to get to that next goal. It's one of the most difficult times. Founders find it incredibly different. We all mess it up. I've messed it up countless times. It's very, very hard. There's a very good book on it that I can talk about later that sort of is a lady who consulted to these people, and it talks about all these different versions. So it's a really interesting read. But I think essentially, the business has to become more, I call it professionalizing a business. I think that's the term most people will use. And the people have to change. And hopefully some will stay and some will make that journey with the founder and some won't. It's an awful time. It really is. It should be an exciting time. But as a founder, you get very attached to everything, particularly your early employees.
Have you seen companies which have been able to retain at least most of their culture as they go through that kind of a transition? Because that's one of the things that I've experienced and I know other people have experienced, that as the company grows, people don't feel like they work for the same company. I mean, they don't work for the same company, but it's not what they signed up for.
No, not really. I mean, if I look at 2 of the greatest examples in Australia of success, which I would call Canberra and Atlassian, right? Those organizations, they are not like working for them in the beginning. They can't possibly be. They have not retained the culture, but they have created a new culture that is just as good, if not better, but in a different manner to different people. So just because your culture changes doesn't mean it has to be a negative thing. And I think that's probably, most people assume that when, it's not like it used to be, it's worse. It's not worse, it's just different. And often it's better. And I think that's, you have that shift of people. And Canva's culture is arguably one of the best in Australia, as is Atlassian's. But if you talk to people who were there in the early years, they wouldn't like it there now, and they didn't. And that's why they left, because they sold out, they turned into a corp. That's not true. The company grew beyond them, and the cultures remain strong, and the cultures remain great, and the cultures are still, some of the best out there. So I think the misconception about a cultural change is that it's negative. It's not negative. It's just different. It just doesn't suit everybody. So I think that's really clear. I mean, I think both those companies have incredible cultures, but they are nothing like they were 5 years ago. There's always an element. There's an element of things people will have. Like any company, there will be things that people keep, some traditions, but they're limited in what you can do there. And it's good to keep some if they can. I think Canva have kept quite a few, which is impressive, but it's a hard thing to do.
Yeah. So I guess it's kind of acknowledging that there's going to be a changing culture, but it's whether that new culture can still be a good one.
Yeah, and I think what both of those organizations did, particularly Canva, was that they were very clear and were communicating this all the way along. It didn't just sort of happen without anyone talking about it, which is like any relationship, right? Whether it be boyfriend, girlfriend, whether it be sibling, whether it be marriage, whether it be work boss, relationships can change, but no one wants to talk about it. It's the elephant in the room. And that's a really bad way. And I'm pretty bad at communicating in relationships, so I know all about this. But if companies can communicate through that and avoid that elephant in the room moment, then they usually are very, very well positioned to maintain a really, really healthy culture, if not make it better.
Yeah, and it's got to be genuine communication, because frankly, if people see like this, slick marketing speech when it comes to, a CEO presentation, people are going to see through it, no problem.
Yeah, that happens when the private equity firms come in. And then it all changes, right? Then you get all the slick things. Everyone goes, yeah, nothing's going to change, they say. I don't know why they say that, but they always say that.
Picking up on a couple of things you mentioned earlier, job security, which actually really surprised me, how there might be more job security in a startup versus a large company, but also what you were saying about taking responsibility for your career much more, not necessarily expecting that senior person to take you by the hand and kind of lead you through. So when someone's coming to you and, maybe they don't have experience of working in a startup environment, but they're interested, how do you advise them to take responsibility for their own career? What can that look like?
Look, I think when you're interviewing someone, there's two typical types of, if we go into sort of HR talk, there's two typical types of interviews that are structured. One is behavioral questions and one is situational questions. So behavioral questions are based on the past. What have you done here? What did you do there? How did you do that? How did you make that grow? What did you do when this person left? Those kinds of things. And they're historical. I think when you're interviewing people for startups, situational questions are far more relevant, where you throw a situation to them and ask them what they would do. And I think there's questions that you can throw out to see how someone is going to react in a situation. And if they say, I'm trying to think of a really good example. I'll give you a great example, actually. And this is from many, many moons ago. And I won't name the companies, but I was there was a merge of two quite large companies, right? And this is the best I've ever seen situational questioning used. And it was created by Gallup for these two companies. And they were merging, there were two people for every role. And what they didn't want is they didn't want the manager who was going to choose which person was in that role to choose the person that came from the company they were in and not the one they didn't, right? So that interesting scenario. So what they did was they said, right, Steve, can you go and sit in on all the interviews? I did 400 interviews. It lasted 7 months, traveled all over Australia. But there was the questions that they would ask in their normal interview. And then they had all these questions that I was supposed to ask. And it was really interesting to see how people's brains work. And it was questions like, how close should people be at work? That's a pretty ambiguous question, right? And it wasn't so much the answer. It was just how they interpreted that question. Some people would literally give a measurement, 2.5 meters. Some people would say, well, I don't think it should be, you should have relationships. Other people say, well, you shouldn't be, it was just, you were actually looking at how they viewed situations. And there was another one that I think that was really poignant, which was, you arrive late to work, everybody else is working, you've been at a meeting, what do you do? Now, some people would freak out. I would never be late for work. Oh, they go into this panic, right? Other people would be, well, like if there was someone there that I could tell about the meeting, I'd probably go and tell them like that. Others would say, I just go to my desk. It was the way that they perceived certain situations. And you can do the same with startups. You can say, you've been working in the startup for X amount of time. Your colleague's just been promoted. You've been doing the same job. You've been coming up with the same ideas, but this has happened. How would you behave in that scenario? And sort of then from that, you can coach them off the back of that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Can you give an example of, say that you were coaching or advising that person in that situation? How might you approach that?
Look, if someone gave an answer that was clearly not going to be suited to a startup. So, for example, they would go, well, I would immediately see my superior and I would probably go and have a conversation with HR. Yeah, see you later. You're not going to work in a startup. You're in the wrong gig, right? So you just tell them and you explain to them why. And some people rebuff that and you may have a conversation. But usually if they give an answer like that in an interview for a startup, it's not so much their reaction. It means they haven't thought about the fact that there isn't an HR and there isn't a process. And so if they haven't thought about it, they're definitely not ready. Now, some people will give you an answer. Well, they'll say, well, normally I would do this, but I obviously understand in startups they wouldn't have that. I don't really know. I guess I'd speak to the founder. Is that what I do? They'd almost start a conversation with you. And then you can start to sort of talk to them about how that scenario might pan out in a startup. So it's really the answer defines how the coaching would go. That doesn't even mean you're going to put them forward for the role, but it prepares you to be able to help them. Once they're into a company or they're getting close to an offer, you would have had, or I would have had many a conversation about where they are as an early stage startup. One of the things we have often done is we take videos of founders talking about what it's like to work at their startups. They get a lot from listening to that, and you ask them what they think about that. And again, their answers will give you an idea of how you can maybe not necessarily correct them, but give them an idea about how that might work out in a company of this size and how that might change as it grows.
So let's finish with someone who has worked in corporate. They've never worked in a startup before, and they kind of like the sound of it. They've listened to this conversation. They're thinking, this is something that could interest me. And so they go, Steve, I'm thinking that I might want to work for a startup. What's the one piece of advice that you would give them above all else?
It's funny, I get about 20 of those emails or LinkedIn messages every day, sometimes a lot more actually. There isn't a singular piece of advice. It would have to be a question of, the first question I would ask them is, what do you know about startups? Do you know anyone that works at them? Based off of that, I would usually tell them to go and do some research. The first thing I would say is, look, do you have any friends who work for startups? No. Okay, why do you want to work for a startup? Go and do some reading, come back to me, tell me what you think it's like to. So I'll get them to go and do some research. Some of them you never hear from again. If they are working for a startup, you say, which one? Generally, it's not a startup. It's like Canva. And you go, Canva is like $1 billion company. It's not a startup. So let's sort of talking about that. So it's really, the first piece of advice is you've got to do your research. Listen to this episode, obviously, because this episode has got lots of information about it. But I think, actually, like you would with anything else, if you were going to go and buy a car, if you were going to go on holiday to Vietnam, you're going to go and do some reading and some research. And there are countless blogs out there. There are countless podcasts. My gosh, there's so many podcasts that talk about what it's like. Go and do that research and see what it is that appeals to you about it, and have a think about yourself and say, in my current job, what do I like the most? What do I hate the most? Do I love the structure or do I hate the structure? Do I love the fact that I feel like I have no impact, or do I hate the point that I have no impact? Do I love the steady income? All those questions. Ask yourself those questions and see if you can work out where you feel you should fit, and then come back and tell me why. That's kind of what I normally do. It's all, because I can't have that conversation for too long with everyone. It would be my whole day. So I usually push them off to try and go and get them to do research. And the ones that do come back are often, there's a good hope. But most, probably 8 out of 10, I never hear from again.
Awesome. I think you were going to mention a book. I'd love to know what that is so I can put it in the show notes.
There's two books I want to mention. One is called Startup to Scale Up, which I think is possibly one of the greatest books to read to understand the journey of going through a startup to scale up. And it talks about this lady who She was in Silicon Valley. I think she was all over the US, and she advised a whole bunch of different founders who went through that journey of startup to scale up and how hard it is. And she goes into quite a lot of detail, but it's lots of short stories. So whereas it's very difficult to say this is how it is because everyone's so different, this gives you probably 30 or 40 different examples. So you get a real feel for, one, the different kind of founder personalities that are out there, and two, the way they approach this journey of going from complete unstructured chaos to structured scaling business. So that, I think, is probably one of the greatest books. Another book I just think everybody should read, I've just finished reading it. It's by Dr. Benjamin Hardy, who I just think is an incredible man. And if anyone has not looked at him, look at him on YouTube, look at him everywhere. But he's got this book called The Gap and the Gain. And The Gap and the Gain talks about how you view yourself and your future self. And I won't go into too much. It's all psychology. It's one of the most interesting psychological books I've read, but also one of the simplest. Anyone can understand it. And it's just fascinating. I would listen to it because he actually reads it on Audible. I prefer listening to books when the authors read them. I don't like it when they don't. And you get a lot of extra sneaky material. But The Gap and the Gain will probably change your view of everything you want to achieve in your life, but it's particularly relevant to the startup world.
And if someone wants to find you or find your company, where would you like to send them?
I'm everywhere. Go on to LinkedIn. I'm everywhere. We produce a lot of content. Look, I think now we've just about got, although we're in the middle of redoing it, obviously LinkedIn, you can find me on LinkedIn, Steve Grace, but thenudgegroup.com is probably the best website. So it's thenudgegroup.com. And all the different things we do are on that page in places. And I think you can also even book an appointment with me on there.
Fantastic. Well, Steve, thanks so much for coming on and sharing your expertise.
My absolute pleasure.
All right, hope you enjoyed that interview with Steve Grace of the Nudge Group. The thing that most surprised me in this interview was when Steve said that working for a startup is not particularly high risk, at least when it comes to redundancy. His view, his experience, is that there's no greater risk of redundancy working for a startup than there is working for a large corporate. In fact, there's a greater risk of redundancy if you work for a big company. That's definitely one of the biggest objections that I sometimes hear about whether or not to choose to work for a startup, so it was interesting hearing what he had to say on that subject. That said, clearly working for a startup can come with an added level of personal responsibility. The fact that it is so changeable, the fact that depending on the stage that it's at, you can be expected to muck in and try out lots of different things, means that you have much greater control and flexibility, and so responsibility for the shape of your own career. Now, arguably, you should have that responsibility for your career anyway, and if you go back to episode 187 of my interview with Louise Lapish, then we talk a lot more there about taking personal responsibility for your own career. But perhaps this is something which is amplified, and perhaps it's something where there's more opportunity if you work in a startup environment. The show notes for this episode are at changeworklife.com/194, that's changeworklife.com/194. And as we enter the final stretch of 2024, I need your ideas for topics to cover next year. As you think about your own career over the next 12 months, what comes up for you? What do you perceive are the biggest challenges for you? Where, if we were having a sit down and a coffee together at the end of 2025, would you like to be able to report that you were at? What might get in the way of you getting there? Let me know the challenges you're facing and we'll see what we can do together to overcome those. And you can let me know using the contact form on my website, changeworklife.com/contact. That's changeworklife.com/contact. We've got 2 episodes left before the end of the year, and just before the holiday season starts, I've got one of my career stories for you. It's with someone who identified a need in his particular industry and built a business around that need. To hear the full story, make sure you're subscribed to the show so you never miss an episode, and I can't wait to see you in 2 weeks' time. Cheers!